Are miracles possible? Well, the materialist says no, but that's what we're going to cover today on Apologetics Monday. Good afternoon. Welcome to A Reason for Hope. Welcome into the studio, one of our co-pastors here at Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson, Arizona, Sean Richards. How you doing, buddy?
Doing okay. Getting ready for summer in Arizona.
Oh, yeah. What was it, 106 today?
Yeah. In May.
Yeah. It's getting warm. We're all depressed and sad. But it's okay. We're here. It's Apologetics Monday, so thanks for tuning in. And if you're new here, this is A Reason for Hope, a weekday Bible answer program where we take questions from our live stream audience. Anyone who wants to chime in, really about anything, most of the days of the week. We do this every Monday through Friday, 4 to 5 p.m. Mountain Standard or Arizona time. And if you are a skeptic or a believer, or maybe someone of faith from a different worldview, and you want to engage and ask questions about the Bible, as long as it's sincere and related to Christian faith and Scripture, we're happy to engage with you. However, on Mondays, we focus a little bit more on a particular topic. We recently finished a whole series on Islam, and now we're focusing on atheism and what those who are skeptical about the existence of God, about miracles and so on, some even saying that they don't really believe that Jesus was even a real person in history. That and many other topics we've been covering here on Apologetics Monday. So if that's something that interests you, you can chime in. We will take questions on Mondays, but usually it's limited to just questions pertaining to today's topic. And today's topic will be a very interesting one. If you are new and you're just kind of wondering where to engage with us, depending on what social media platform you're on, you can catch us on YouTube, which is our YouTube channel is A Reason for Hope. So if you go to youtube.com/ type in @AReason4Hope, you can catch us that way. We also have our church Facebook page, which is CCF Tucson or Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson, Arizona. Again, just use the comment section to ask your questions. It's pretty off the cuff. Most days we don't have sort of a planned script like a lot of podcasts do. We just kind of want to engage with people in real time. You can also catch us on the X platform by following our senior pastor, Scott Richards, and his handle on X is ScottR4H. That's Scott with a double T, the letter R, the number 4, the letter H. If you want to avoid social media altogether, you can just go to our website, calvarychristianfellowship.com, hit that Watch Live tab, and not only can you comment and ask questions, you don't have to have an account, but you can also watch all of our services, which we have our Wednesday evening Oasis service at 6:30 p.m. and our Sunday mornings at 9 and 11. If you want to catch the services online. You can also email your questions, especially if you have something personal you want to ask, how it relates to your life, and you have a situation you want to give us a little bit of background information on, but don't want to blast that over the internet, then just email us, and that email address is questions@areasonforhope.org. That's questions@areason4hope.org. Before we get your questions, we always have the habit of praying before we start, and because we have a lot of believers from all over the world just kind of chiming in and listening. And so we just encourage us to do this sort of like we're a gathering of believers talking about things that matter to us. So if you don't mind joining us, Sean, if you'll take a moment and get us kicked off.
Be an honor. Thank you for the privilege you've given Adrian and I to be able to engage in this very relevant topic, not only in how you've revealed yourself to the world, but how the world tends to turn a blind eye anyway. We want to ask that hearts would be softened, if not converted, as a result of the hearts of the issues that are brought to the forefront here today, and that Adrian and I would be given words of grace seasoned with salt to not only confront these poor and inconsistent standards that are used to reject your revelation of yourself, but even more importantly, to be given the kind of heart that would make you appealing for who you are by nature, not just a miracle worker, but the God who changes hearts and lives, the God who has not only revealed himself in history, but has established himself in our hearts through the miracle of your resurrection. We pray this in the name of your Son. Amen.
Amen. Thanks so much again for tuning in. And if you're in the Tucson area, I just wanted to give you a little reminder that in July we have our VBS. I've been forgetting, but I wanted to promote it real quick that we have our Vacation Bible School starting in July. I had the date in my head and I just forgot it, but I'll tell you here in a moment. That VBS will start in July 13th to the 17th. It's in the morning, so it's 9 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. If you are in the Tucson area and you think, oh gosh, I would love for my kids to have something fun to do for the week, and in July, and it's all sort of indoors, and we have a whole, it's really awesome. So if you want to bring your kids, you can do that. That would be great. All right. So today, miracles are impossible. That's kind of bold claim, because I always assume that if someone were to make the claim that God does not exist, or a little black rock with pink polka dots does not exist, you'd have to have sort of exhaustive knowledge of all history, of all reality, and every corner of the universe to know that certain things do not exist. And that kind of knowledge is unattainable, it seems. So to say that miracles are impossible does seem to come with it a whole set of issues to cover. So Sean, what drew you first on how to choose this topic, and how relevant, how many people do actually, who hold to like a materialistic or agnostic, atheistic worldview, would you say actually use this as an argument against theists or anyone who believes in that something exists out of physical reality?
Hard and embittered experience, and usually the kind that are willing to have more than one conversation with you. Gotcha. Obviously, when you encounter atheists on the internet, they'll just throw out whatever sounded fun on a Reddit or social media forum, and it will be ultimately left to change the topic from there. But understand that we're not here dealing with the average atheist troll. We're equipping you to hopefully encounter the kinds of individuals across any demographic that not only have a worldview, but also are willing to acknowledge one beyond their own. Now, remember, atheists are like any other human being on the planet. And as I said before, they have a worldview and view all of the evidence that they are given through a series of assumptions that this worldview allows them to see things through. This will cause them to dismiss evidence that goes against what they already assume to be true and automatically accept what fits into what they've already decided in advance is true. Now, you may say this is a unfair generalization, but the reality is that everyone does this. Christians do it, Muslims do it, cult groups do it, and we all have a starting point of where we know what we know. The problem here isn't that we have a worldview. It's ultimately just dependent on whether or not we've chosen a proper worldview. Does it answer all of the right questions, and does it keep us from all kinds of errors? And the passion we will preserve those views depends on mainly what we will gain or lose from abandoning or accepting certain ideas. For example, historically, the first generation of Christians were abandoning a worldview that allowed them to live comfortably in the Roman Empire and accommodated their desires for excess food, sex, and a pursuit of power. And instead, they received a worldview that demanded moral excellence and self-control in these categories. It cost them their standing with their communities, the government, their families, and periodically would cost them their lives. Unlike atheists, however, Christians had to count the cost and were told up front what the price would be that they would have to pay. They were told in advance that, of course, they would be persecuted, and the only thing that they had to go on as far as the reasons for changing this worldview was a historically verified miracle. The gain of this was the promise of a physical resurrection, but nothing actually gained in this physical life. We also would see in the atheist community that while their worldview doesn't really give them much of a price to pay, they do, however, have reasons they believe they gain from the new worldview. Individual by the name of Huxley became an atheist because he, and I quote, said that it allows me to justify my sexual mores. My biological father became an atheist because it preserved his relationship with my grandfather, his father. The now former atheist Christopher Hitchens became an atheist because he despised Christians on a personal level. It's not complicated. But understand that in conversations worth being prepared for, you will still be given reasons as to why they have this worldview. And it would be the same as anyone else. They believe that the series of assumptions that come with it accept more of what is true and prevent less of what is true, or isn't true, I should say, than the religious worldview. And we can't fault them for that. Choosing wisely with the most effective filter, if you want to use the term, from deception is just like anyone else would want a social media algorithm to filter out and ultimately block fake news channels, vulgar ads, abusive people, and things that we would not like to deal with over and over again while we're trying to relax. There's only one problem. A system that filters out information can and does exclude things that are true that we maybe just don't like. And this is where people's priorities are ultimately shown. No one is obligated to view, examine, or test every single claim made about politics, culture, and art in order to have an opinion on it. It's only when you make a universal statement against it that all of that data now comes against you. And this is where you were mentioning, Adrian, all is a very risky claim for a worldview to claim for itself. The atheist claim that all miracles are false would only require one miracle to be true from any world religion or background for the entire worldview to fall apart. And this is where we get the opportunity to have some fun dialogue, because as you present the evidence for one miracle in particular, you can also be prepared to hear their best and worst arguments against the concept entirely. So notice this is what we're addressing, not the idea of, well, that miracle is false or this miracle is fraudulent. They're addressing the whole category and emphasizing one that you can, of course, stand both of your feet on comfortably is where they'd have to do or die, because they've made a claim against all, so here's one. You don't have to take the word of every single miracle claim because, again, what's enough to take out the whole tower? Now, here's where we get into the reasons that hopefully your atheist friends will give for their worldview if they're the type of personality that is willing to have a second conversation about these things in good faith. And that is, of course, that fancy word you mentioned earlier, Adrian, that of naturalism, emphasizing nature or what's pertaining to the five senses. The main argument philosophically that they would use to disqualify miracles as even being a thing isn't just to say that there's only the material and nothing else. That's an assertion, not a proven fact. But what they want to do is go into the realm of philosophy, to take the idea of a miracle and reveal that it's incoherent. And to do this, they've made a number of arguments. The first is written by a man by the name of Immanuel Kant, who said in his Law of Empirical Verifiability, anything that isn't true by definition or empirically verifiable is meaningless. So, for those of you who don't speak fancy, here's the general gist of it. Something that would be true by definition would be things that are self-evident, that you can not only observe, but see the effects of at any place and any time. The laws of physics, chemistry, and mathematics are true by definition, even though they aren't observable to the senses. Immanuel Kant would say it's obvious that physics, chemistry, and math are true because you can verify them right in front of you. They're universal principles that are true by definition. And it's not circular reasoning to say math is true because math is true because math is true. It's a law in nature. We would also note that things pertaining to the senses, something empirically verifiable. Empiricism is another way of describing naturalism, that of course there are only things that you can observe with the five senses, taste, touch, smell, etc., that are evident, that are, and this is the most important part of his argument, relevant to human beings, that can be known. So when they make this argument, and this is, again, where atheists sometimes take it too far, because, spoiler alert, Immanuel Kant wasn't an atheist, he still made the assertion that things like matter and energy are meaningful because their nature and function are observable to the senses. You can see it, you can taste it, you can smell it, you can touch it, you can interact with it. The problem with this argument is that the statement isn't true by definition or empirically verifiable. Now, if anyone here hasn't followed me on this, remember the claim is anything that isn't true by definition or empirically verifiable is meaningless. That statement, is it true by definition or is it an assertion philosophically? Is it empirically verifiable, or is it asserting an observation, a principle in nature that has to be proven, not, of course, is self-evident? It's the argument, not the conclusion. So the first and most well-sourced support for a worldview and philosophy based on naturalism, the rejection of the supernatural, is self-defeating. And what we mean by that is, if it's true, then the standard that is used to judge that it's true proves it to be false. And if the standard is false, then it can't claim to be true. Either way, it's what they call the catch-22, or as Norman Geisler wrote in his book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, a roadrunner approach. The coyote runs off the cliff, looks down, and realizes he doesn't have any ground to stand on. So the argument itself that seeks to disqualify miracles from the equation is to argue, as Immanuel Kant did to his everlasting shame, that a miracle is trying to explain nothing interacting with something. But once again, he identifies nothing as something observable beyond the senses. And in this law and principle, he's making a huge assumption in a standard, putting forward in this argument, that doesn't meet its own qualifications, that it's not actually coherent. Now, it hasn't stopped philosophy textbooks for the last 100 years from trying to publish this as the defining and crowning achievement, arguing for naturalism. But even going through a cursory reading of Immanuel Kant's books, which is a feat in of itself, you notice that he's not against the idea of the supernatural. He's just saying, this is what's relevant and observable to me.
Yeah, philosophically, he was trying to sort of kick God out the front door, but then letting him sneak in the back door. Because he wasn't an atheist.
He was a deist that said that the supernatural can't be known fully by human beings.
Yeah, he was dealing with epistemological issues, which is, epistemology is the study of how we know or how we attain or arrive at knowledge, genuine knowledge or propositional truths about reality.
But much like with a lot of internet sloganeering, they'll take a little sliver of part of an argument, think it proves their case entirely without understanding the framework that led up to it or the point that it brought up, and present it in such a way where it ends up being self-defeating. So this is the first and main issue, and it says, well, I can't see it, I can't taste it, I can't touch it. Why is that relevant to me? Well, that's coming from a guy who believed in things other than what he could observe with the senses, but also understand, if you make that the rule, I can't see it, therefore it's not true. Is that rule something you can see, or is it something you believe to be true beyond what you can see? And
that's how we typically respond to most of these types of arguments, is to just apply the principle logic to itself. So if a statement does not logically cohere, then it's self-defeating, self-contradictory. So if I say I cannot speak a word of English, that's one example of me affirming that which I'm denying at the same time. So if someone says you cannot, and just to clarify these terms, empiricism, naturalism, materialism, they're all different categories about roughly around the same worldview, but empiricism is the idea that you can only attain knowledge through the five senses, that only the scientific method can arrive at truth. Scientism is, again, a more descriptive, but you can only arrive at truth about reality through the sciences. Materialism is the idea, is more of a kind of an ontological idea, really, that the universe is only comprised of material. There is nothing in the universe that is non-material. Everything is comprised of matter. Natural is the idea that is more of in my opinion, it just seems like it's more of a phenomenological term, describing that only all phenomena can be explained naturally, that only nature, every action and reaction can all be understood through natural processes. So those are the different terms, and they can sometimes be used interchangeably, but they actually do have different meanings. Empiricism and naturalism is not the same thing. You can be an empiricist when it comes to how you know, but still not be a naturalist. So just to understand the different terms. Does that make sense, Sean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, this is where then they might shift gears if they understand what they said and what you said likewise. You speak at this level, sometimes you get terms that Aristotle coined, and then you end up feeling like your brain's turning to jello. But instead, they may say, well, it's not a universal principle. Let's just talk about in terms of what's most likely to be true. And this is where we get into the argument from probability. Now, again, popularized from Immanuel Kant's writings, his principle of theoretical impossibility is essentially to claim that if something is less likely to happen or more likely to happen, the wise man believes in what's more likely in favor of what's less likely. Now, that may seem fairly straightforward, but when it's used as an objection to a miracle, that something miraculous is not only an interaction between something and nothing, which is not what Christians have ever believed about a miracle, but also making it into, well, it's less likely to be true, therefore it's not likely to be true. Well, that, again, is where we actually get into another problem, because instead of using Immanuel Kant's arguments to defeat their own assumption, they'll criticize what a miracle is rather than set the standard for reality that doesn't allow for miracles, that the odds are ultimately always in favor of what's rational, of what's meaningful, of what's most likely, as to say that rare occurrences can't happen as opposed to don't happen. Both, of course, sound silly when you say it out loud, but let's go through a few examples just so we understand what the argument is. If a friend comes across a large sum of money, is it more rational to believe he came across it dishonestly through theft and fraud than honestly through, say, winning a lottery? Well, both are possible. One is less likely than the other, but notice the goal of this argument to say that miracles are less likely to happen, therefore it should always be assumed that something natural happened instead. We talked about this last week with the principle of the God of the gaps fallacy. Well, once again, is it possible for someone to win the lottery? Yes, it is very unlikely, but it would be very weird for someone to say they are rational in calling the police on someone because they suddenly came across a large sum of money. There is more than one possibility here. They could have gotten it through an inheritance. They could have gotten it through wise investments. They could have been saving and you just didn't know about them having this money. To say something is less likely to be true does not mean that it's in the either or category. They're fraudulent, or they are, of course, violating the laws of physics, that something has come in contact with nothing. If an athlete were to set a new world record, would it be more rational to believe they achieved it dishonestly through performance-enhancing drugs or cheating rather than honestly through the same hard work all other athletes trained through? Once again, it's missing the whole point of the conversation. Rare isn't reason to reject. The fact that records are broken and the fact that people can and do cheat does not mean it's more rational to assume it is false, it is fraudulent, it is dishonest for an athlete to honestly come across breaking world records than for a miracle to take place and dismiss it, saying they must be, Oz trying to use technology to deceive someone to preserve their own reputation. They need to be examined individually, not categorically dismissed. We could note, again, probably most relevant to a Christian conversation, that if a religious figure is claimed to have risen from the dead, they would say they are more rational in believing their followers were lying than to believe they actually transcended the laws of nature. Once again, it's an either-or in this worldview based on probabilities. And while recently failed Captain America movies may try to claim that understanding probability automatically means omniscience, it's not. The odds don't determine reality because odds are broken all the time. And what's hilarious about this is that when we talk about improbability, meaning certainty, it's ultimately recognizing or failing to acknowledge the fact that they are incredibly inconsistent when it comes to this. Because note, if the argument, and I'm not saying the atheist has done this yet, you want to ask them on a person-by-person basis, just like we would want them to examine miracle claims on a claim-by-claim basis. If they adopt a worldview that the universe and life within it all spontaneously came into existence with no cause and continuously developed favorable mutations that transitioned it from species to species, what are the odds of that happening? Well, let's just say improbable for the sake of time. But let's also then ask if they're willing to say, well, the universe is here, so clearly it was the breaking of long odds. So you're willing to accept, based on the outcome, that it must have been the breaking of these odds, when the lack of odds, the long odds that are present in miracles, are the same metric you reject them as having taken place by principle, on a rule-by-rule basis, not on a case-by-case basis. So once again, we see that categorically dismissing miracles from an individual who doesn't even agree with their worldview, in order to prove something, he wasn't trying to argue and saying that because it's not following a standard that doesn't follow its own rules, or it's not within an acceptable range of probability, for me to say that that is an appropriate explanation, we don't say, well, what are the odds of that happening? If it's low, then I'm going to say it didn't happen. Then they believe evolution. Oh, well, it's not something I can observe with the senses. It's not here right in front of me, and it's not a law of nature. So therefore, I'm going to reject it. But at the same time, what do? They would not apply that same standard to the very standard itself. So let's get into more modern examples. If Immanuel Kant failed them, then maybe more modern atheists who, again, don't have the kind of reputation that would make them the ones you talk about today, but nevertheless, it's still used. Michael Shermer, also known as Skirt Chaser Shermer, he isn't thought of well among atheist circles right now, was once again putting forward this argument in a lot of his debates in favor of naturalism. And Shermer's last law was as follows: advanced technology is indistinguishable from God. Now, in the modern news cycle, which I'm sure in the next week or so will have gone the way of the dinosaurs, is making the concept of alien life and civilizations and anime cat girls or whatever into the public sphere and on everyone's mind. They're trying to put this forward as saying that, well, if you say that a miracle happened, well, how do you know that it wasn't just powerful aliens that were messing with you? For example, medieval peasants would have seen modern medical technology like vaccines and antibiotics used to cure what they deemed as incurable, divine and supernatural if they interacted with it. In, say, the 1st through 3rd centuries AD of Rome, they would have seen industrial production technology and entertainment as the power of the gods. If Bronze Age pagans would have seen drone technology and modern weaponry, they would have thought that it was supernatural. On and on it goes. But here's the main issue, and this is, again, why so few atheists get away with this in arguments about the supernatural today, including the guy who came up with it. To assume gullibility as the only motivation for believing something to be a miracle is to misrepresent what non-naturalist people mean by a miracle. And this is where it ultimately gets down to it: to categorically dismiss all miracle claims as the product of either time-traveling pranksters or hyper-advanced civilizations in order to avoid the obvious shows they're not looking for an explanation, they're looking for an excuse. Because to say that something in the future would be what we'd falsely conclude as miraculous isn't proving what we're seeing in the present. It's entirely theoretical. It's not actually addressing the data in front of them. It's saying, but what if? But how could? But you would. When ultimately, what is actually happening? Something that wouldn't have happened, and we'll get into this more in a second, without outside interference, did happen, and now we have to resort to time travel. Now we have to resort to alien civilizations. Now we have to resort to things that they also now have to prove are present and motivated to mess with us for malicious or superficial purposes, in order to just ignore the fact that there is a better, more probable, dare I say, explanation available to us here. So the point being made in all of these, and these are the best ones that we can come up with without just ultimately arguing from the same premise, arguing from probabilities, from possibilities, and self-defeating principles don't actually address the data. That there are, in fact, fraudulent miracle claims, but there are also legitimate ones, and we only need one for the atheist claim that miracles are impossible by nature to be false. And there are plenty of other arguments that, again, are either branches of the same mistake or just things that you ought to get used to responding to over and over and over again, because you'll either encounter someone who isn't sincere enough to acknowledge when they've made a bad point, or someone who isn't educated enough to engage with these things properly. They'll argue, for example, that I can't see God, an argument from personal experience. So if God's there, then where is he? There are things that even an atheist worldview would acknowledge exists even though they can't see them. Microorganisms, foreign planets and galaxies, even people that they haven't met do exist even though they don't see them presently and probably never will see them this side of eternity. We could note their negative association with Christianity. I don't care what a Christian says happened. I'm more willing to believe the atheist. Well, while I do appreciate the fact that having less reasons to trust somebody is a common motivating factor, we're not dealing with people and your willingness to trust them. We're dealing with the data, what actually happened. And your more moral and emotional perception of Christians doesn't mean what they say is false by definition. For example, if I were to say, well, I'm not going to believe anything that a Muslim says happened, or I'm not going to believe anything because a Mexican says it happened, or I'm not going to believe it, they'd see the bigotry and irrational, basically piecemeal and picking and choosing application of this that's going on here. We could say, like we mentioned before with Kant's rule, it's too rare to be real. If it was a miracle, then why doesn't God do it more often? Well, just like with Kant's probability law, the whole point of a miracle is to get someone's attention. So if the only way God provided evidence for himself, if God was real, why doesn't he just make a miracle happen or something? Then used something that happens all the time anyway, it wouldn't mean anything to anyone. For example, if a singer can't claim that their song is successful unless all other music is being produced at their time and is selling just as well, then they can't say their song is successful. You can't say this is miraculous, a rare event, unless it happens all the time. So you can't say this is a #1 hit unless everyone is selling just as much. You can't claim MVP status in a season unless everyone on his team performed just as well as they did in those games. You can't argue exceptionalism. A runner can't claim to have the best time in a race unless everyone finished at that same rate. Once again, it doesn't happen often enough, isn't going to be able to meet any other standard of reality, let alone the one that we're presently trying to deal with. What appears to be is something that needs to be looked into. To dismiss it categorically because it doesn't happen enough is to miss the point of what we mean by a miracle. Some would even just argue that it's fraud, that it was faked, that scientists debunked that already. Well, even if they mention a scientist as their infallible authority on all things supernatural, wearing their priestly garbs and so forth, saying something doesn't make it true. Just like if a Christian were to say it, they too have to actually have good reasons for it. And even if they said by a category they trust in by faith in their profession, despite it not being what they're educated in or qualified to give an informed opinion about, suddenly they realize that they are on the receiving end of the religiously dogmatic zealot. Because once again, they say, well, here's a scientific claim. And I say, that scientific claim is false. My pastor or priest debunked that already. Now suddenly it sounds foolish. Well, why is it that they suddenly gain the capacity to see a problem with their worldview when it's being used against them, but not when they themselves are using it? It's almost as if there's inconsistency here. And this is where we get into the actual definition of a miracle. Now, Adrian, you co-wrote a book that not only addressed the skills and talents of your profession, but even more so specifically on the topic of miracles, Jesus of Nazareth and the concept as a whole. If someone were to actually be fair in this conversation, approach you and say, well, what would a miracle actually be? Generally, from a biblical worldview, the simplest way I'd put it is an act of God to verify a word from God that reveals the nature of God. When nature or the natural order of nature is interfered with by an outside influence, there's certainly higher or lower standards. We can talk about coincidence, where the natural order's interfered with, but not necessarily in line with the purposes of God. We can talk about providence, where nature is interfered with, but in no direct word from God to verify it. It might be God's purposes, but we don't have confirmation. And then, of course, outright miracles. If we were to drop this mouse and catch it, the natural order is for it to hit the table, but it didn't. Why? Because my hand interfered with it. That's not necessarily a miracle, though. What were some of the most important things that you kind of had to define your terms in writing your book? And when skeptics come to you and say, I have no reason to believe your miracle, archaic pseudoscience, what are the most important things for you to clarify as far as what a miracle actually is?
Yeah, that's a good question, because we throw the word around a lot, and it's sort of in our modern vernacular to say, oh, that was a miracle. Usually we mean something that's very highly unlikely to occur, but is to my benefit, and therefore it's miraculous. Like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that I didn't get hit by that car. That was a miraculous moment. But and it's easy to, like, I fall into the trap of always defining miracles as the breaking of the laws of physics by something outside, that exists outside the confines of length, width, height, matter, time, and energy, just outside of nature. And so I typically define a miracle as something that's supernatural, something that breaks the laws of physics, not something that's just unlikely. God existing is not in and of itself a miracle. It's when God intervenes in the nature that he created that he performs a miracle. And so I try to stick with, like, a good example of this contrast is how when Paul describes the activity of the evil one, he says counterfeit miracles in I think 2 Thessalonians
Chapter 2, yeah.
He describes he describes powers, wonders, and signs, things that boggle the mind, and he describes them as his activity, the Antichrist activity, is in accord with the power of Satan, performing these counterfeit miracles. So if something is a phenomena, something that's fantastic, supernatural appearing, but is not genuinely supernatural, meaning he's not actually breaking the laws of physics, which only God can do, then that would be a proper definition for miracles. That means that when God intervenes and breaks the laws of nature, doing something that only God can do, like calling fire from the sky, raising the dead, healing the sick, the blind, the crippled, and so on, predicting the future, things that is unnatural for any being, any created being to do, that only is reserved for someone who exists outside of time, outside of nature, is not confined by nature, which is the definition of God. Even if you don't believe in God, you can still at least agree on a definition of something that is, ultimately powerful, ultimately knowledgeable, infinite in every aspect, and yet and can intervene. So transcendent and imminent, or intervenes. And so when it came to the subject, because you mentioned there's gullible people, how do we not know that there was some Chris Angel of the first century that duped people? How do we know that Jesus wasn't just a really good, clever sleight of hand artist? And so you have to break it down through, and for me being an illusionist, I would break it down through what is possible naturally, how deception works, because there is limits to what a person can pull off when it comes to counterfeit miracles. There is a limit of what you can do, and it's all usually related to technology and what's available. So if the magicians of Egypt did the same thing as Moses did using their secret arts, they would have been limited by the knowledge and time and technology they had available to them in their world. And so they couldn't have done things like what maybe a modern magician could do, but they could do and get away with things that they could have gotten away with then. And so we see this contrast of Moses performing miracles. He's actually breaking the laws of physics. He's taking dead matter and turning it into a living, breathing snake. The magicians of Egypt had to create the illusion of creating dead matter into a living, breathing snake. And then when it gets to something where it's beyond their technology, they have to now, at the risk of their lives, go to Pharaoh and say, oh, we can't do this one. We actually can't take dust and turn it into lice. And then they said, this is the finger of God. So even for them, they had a definition of a miracle. They looked at something that broke nature, that could not be accomplished through deception, through technology, through applying the laws of physics, something that broke the laws of physics. You know, bodies don't naturally come back to life. There are mechanisms in cells that require a natural process to live. And so when something is dead, it's dead. If it comes back, then something is defying nature. And so that's how I've always looked at the general, broad level, a miracle is something that breaks the laws of physics, something that breaks nature, something that intervenes from the outside. And that's the problem with the naturalists or the atheists, is that they assume the system is closed. They assume that whatever confines are built into nature, whether you believe that there are some things we don't understand in the vastness of space and there are other dimensions that we see as spiritual but really are just other dimensions of physical reality that we can't observe. Like the analogy sometimes people will use is that if you were to create a two-dimensional being and you live in a three-dimensional existence, they would only be aware of, the XY axis. They would not be aware of the third dimension. So I could literally tap them on the head, and they would not know what's tapping me on the head because my head means nothing. It's a meaningless. To look up is meaningless to a two-dimensional being, and I'm three-dimensional. Well, what if there were, some physicists suggest there are up to 11, maybe even 14 different dimensions mathematically in the universe, and these are all, of course, theoretical, all through math. But we are completely unaware of these different dimensions. There could be actual realities in our physical material universe that exist in these different planes, and that's not supernatural. It's just a different plane of existence. And so, you can tinker around with that sort of thing, but, for the most part, that's kind of how I kind of process through that line of thinking.
And obviously, when it comes to clarifying the difference, we want as high a standard as possible. When Nabil Qureshi wrote in his book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, his testimony basically, and working these things out, he came from a very superstitious and gullible family background. If any sort of dream were to happen, they thought it was a sign from Allah. And if, anyone were to give him a dirty look, then, they've cast jinn on me and stuff. And obviously, he was a very intelligent, a very rational, a very, let's just put it mildly, he was a genius when it came to processing and examining information, which is, again, what worked in ultimately leading him to the gospel. When he heard challenges to Islam, he wasn't the one to just blow it off and trust his local internet apologist. He was the one who looked up the sources and then said, well, what reason do I have to trust this? And then things started to get a little slippery. He made an illustration in his book, and we want to make sure that we give proper citing to this, when he noted 3 building examples to the kind of scenario that maybe would have been classified as a miracle. If someone was blind and then they could see, does that classify as a miracle? Well, it's certainly a breaking of the natural order of things, but it's not associated with any purpose or something that you can verify as coming from God. You would be appropriate in saying not normal, but not supernatural unless I have reason to conclude so. So he asked for maybe further details. He said, well, I prayed and then had my sight restored. Well, that's, once again, not a miracle. You could associate it with the supernatural, but it's still more likely to be either psychosomatic or coincidental. Those factors are still on the table, because if God, as a conscious being willing to interfere in the laws of reality, if the goal of miracles is either for our benefit as house pets, essentially, we spare ourselves a trip to the vet by just asking him for it, then if that's where his priorities were at, we should expect to see that all the time, but we don't. So where are God's priorities in miracles? In his perspective, both for Islam and Christianity, Allah only sent down signs, and the God of the Bible only performed miracles in order to verify his word. Now, of course, to different strains and different strokes, but the principle and the rule is there. So speaking as now a Christian said, well, you have the blind now seeing. You have the guy praying as the alleged means. But what if before he received his healing, he was led to a church service where the local pastor prayed over him, and then someone exercising the gift of prophecy and healing said, I want you to go home. I want you to apply this very specific product that I've never been to your house on. I want you to apply this to your eyes. I'm going to send a deacon home with you to help you with this. He's going to pray over you. Then you will receive your sight for the purpose of knowing that God loves you and that this is how he's going to confirm his nature to you. If his eyes were then healed, we would not only note the long odds being broken, that oil generally doesn't restore sight, we'd have the religious association through the prayer and the laying on of hands, and the verbal prophetic confirmation in alignment with what we know about the God that is allegedly doing the healing. It can have another explanation, but it's narrowed down to the point where considering other options sounds silly. And this is ultimately where we see the God of the Bible wanting to do his work. Now, we also recognize that when it comes to these long, odd situations, there are coincidences in this world. And note, if you work backwards from a number of different factors, just try and look up online sometime the bizarre historical coincidences in history, the Titan and the Titanic having very similar tragedies take place, but yet not within a century. The bombing of the World Trade Center and the 9/11 attacks, and noting the time and dates of those things. One of my favorites is Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, two completely opposite ends of the political spectrum, but both founding fathers and signers of the Declaration of Independence, both dying on the same day, on July 4th, on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. You're just like, what are the odds of that?
That's peculiar.
But no religious affiliation and no written word or prophetic word to note and identify this is where God's priorities are.
Yeah.
Odd things can happen.
I'd probably distinguish between the purpose of miracles and the meaning of miracles and the what of a miracle. So when I look at these biblical accounts where you're dealing with two opposing views, you know, Moses, Aaron, and the Pharaoh's magicians, Elijah and the prophets of Baal, the Antichrist and Jesus. You know, I see what is the phenomenon that is being described, and how is God using what he does compared to what the others do. And that's why I try to make that real sharp distinction between miracles of what they are, what is happening is a breaking of the laws of physics, not just... Now, of course, there could be other hallmarks that say a miracle of God always also has a prophetic meaning, a message, an ultimate grand purpose, not just the purpose of breaking the laws of physics, but to authenticate his word. There may be other purposes around miracles, but I try to encourage believers to break away from too loosely using the word miracle.
Yeah.
You know, coincidence. Oh, it was a miracle that this circumstance was achieved because I prayed. Well, it may have been a legitimate answer to prayer. God may have even intervened.
Yeah.
You know, like I love that movie, The Adjustment Bureau, if you've seen it, where basically everything's sort of, you know, they see the course of time, and anytime the plan is getting off track, they go and make little adjustments, like a guy tripping on a street corner, and instead of running into this person, they run into that person, and their whole course of their lives are all basically pre-designed, that you have no free will. And we don't want to look at God that way. There are natural things that occur, and then God uses natural things to actually accomplish his will. He doesn't always have to perform a miracle to accomplish his will. That's how sovereign God is.
But we also note that, say, for example, the recognition of our need of salvation, 1 Corinthians 12:3, does not happen except by the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
That unless God had intervened, the law of nature would result in our ongoing moral and spiritual corruption.
Yeah, right,
So
yeah.
we recognize that, A, because we have chapter and verse. That's the
Yeah.
sort of thing God does. That's where his priorities are at. Ezekiel 33:11, 2 Peter 1:9, or 3:9, all of these examples. But if someone were to say, go into the realms of, I could probably say thank you to God for this, because it's clearly got some of his fingerprints on it. Even then, we wouldn't say it's a full miracle. That would be
Yeah.
more in the line of providence. And
Yeah.
a great example that was made in Norman Geisler's book on this, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, once again, he mentioned the fog banks at D-Day covering the Allies' advance into Normandy, coincidentally, at the same time that Hitler was coming off of a meth bender and couldn't be disturbed, so that the Axis's supreme command in Europe couldn't organize a defense until the Operation Market Garden. So what effectively ended the war, which was relevant to the affairs of God, because at the time the Axis powers were targeting the Jewish people ethnically, you may have heard of it, and at the same time the Allies making this move in opposition to this unbridled evil was somewhat, well, as General Eisenhower later observed, God's with us in this. But when we ask the question, does that qualify as a miracle? Well, there wasn't any predictions, but you could argue that the opposition to this evil was something God could have nudged along through things of nature. The timing is good, the purpose is good, but it's still not good enough to be a full-grade, third-degree miracle.
Yeah, and I like that. I'm glad you're making that distinction between divine providence and a miracle. I mean, the Iron Dome defending against I don't know how many hundreds of drones and missiles in Israel was pretty unlikely. I mean, it was near miraculous. I mean, it was
I know
definitely
one
providence,
of the guys who was programming that as a software engineer, and he's like, no, that was not what that was built to handle.
Not a single one got through. That's amazing. But yeah, I could see how you might say, well, I don't know if it can be explained naturally, and yes, you could say, oh, well, they were just lucky, or there was divine providence. And you know, I had a friend who was just a dear mentor, got me into the marketing side of what I do for my little side hustle as a web sort of designer, and he had stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and he was on his deathbed, and this was our last conversation. It was very heartfelt and sad, a lot of crying and just appreciation. He used to be my worship pastor when I first became a believer at Cassis, and we're just talking. He was one of those guys that really believed that God always heals. And you know, we don't hold to that view, and he and I used to debate that before he was diagnosed, and obviously I wasn't going to bring it up, you know, when he was on his deathbed. But
not helpful.
But he brought it up. He just said, yeah, I always believed that God would heal me, and I think God still has a miracle in place for me. And I just said, well, you know, you've lived, I mean, he was in his late mid-80s. I mean, he was sharp, too. And I said, gosh, I pray and hope to God that I could be even nearly as sharp as you are when I'm your age. I hope that I could live as long as you have. This is sad that this is how your life's ending, but how do you know that God, how many times do you think God might have already healed you? Maybe you've been, basically your body's been fighting pancreatic cancer or some other kind of cancer for decades, and God has been healing you and healing you and healing you. We really don't know how many times God providentially intervenes into our daily lives as believers, even as nations and governments. I mean, that's what we believe about the sovereignty of God. It's not that God that everything happens as God's will, but that God is always involved and intimately involved in the creation, in the lives of his people. The Bible says that in him we live and move and have our being. It says that God basically holds the fabric of the universe and reality together on a moment-by-moment basis. So God's providence is so grand and hard to detect that we have to make that differentiation between God always being involved in his people's lives and in creation versus when God actually, like you said, for a very specific purpose, breaks the laws of physics to demonstrate that it is God and that his actions and his messengers are true. And so that to me makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and this is where it ultimately comes down to it. It's almost as if we're the ones who have a higher standard for miracles than the atheist does, because they're not even willing to look at the data. We have not only set concern for the reputation of God, we don't want fraud associated with his name or the sometimes motivations and actions that cult groups are taking to put forward false miracles, which we would affirm as satanic, in order to put forward a false message. We're the ones who want to examine the data. We're the ones who want to be scientific and ask, based on the theology, the contrary data, look at and examine the doctrine this is putting forward to distinguish it from providence or coincidence or miracle. And this is where ultimately we note who's in the more rational position. First, the one who wants to have the conversation,
Yeah.
but the second, who's willing to look at the data, not with an unbiased eye, that's impossible, but someone who's willing to handle the data and test it even if they don't like the conclusion it leads to. Now, in a world where, of course, internet boldness enables them to say, I only ever follow the evidence, and wouldn't, of course, know even how to spell evidence, and usually can't. But if, on the other hand, putting themselves in a position in a worldview that cultivates a willingness to examine these things,
Yeah.
that when, say, for example, prophets of God were putting forward new scripture, they were taking their lives into their hands because the schools of the prophets and Levites would be combing through this with Deuteronomy all the way open and asking, is this consistent with the character of God? What public signs or predictions of the future have you done that we know have come to pass? What reason do we have to trust you? This is the worldview that the atheist worldview has parasitically attached itself to while undermining the motivation.
Yeah.
A God of truth doesn't want a lie to be propagated. The atheist, to their credit, has borrowed this worldview while at the same time undermining the chief and core principles, which is why then what would be an example of an actual miracle? We would say, among others, the historical death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Why? Well, first and foremost, because as you said, laws of nature, the dead stay dead, especially after a full Roman crucifixion. In the Strauss critique, one of the most verbose and eloquent critiques of Christianity in the last 200 years, he threw out the apparent death theory because it depends on people having no idea what a Roman crucifixion does to the human body. We recommend William D. Edwards' On the Physical Death of Jesus to fully appreciate just how dead Jesus' death was.
Yeah.
Then, noting all historical principles, there were three main things. There's more, but for the sake of time, that historians look for in order to test claims as valid. Accounts of embarrassment, lots of accounts, and early accounts. All of the reports of Jesus' appearances to his followers, alive again after his publicly documented death, burial, and resurrection, came from people not including his followers, who had all abandoned him. Those would be accounts of embarrassment, not just from the eyewitnesses themselves, early account and testimony, but most importantly, the two sources, which also qualifies double dissimilarity, the strictest of all historical standards. If you have hostile people acknowledging the key core claims of your belief or your claim about history, it's as good as gold. We have not one, but two. James ben Yosef, the biological half-brother of Jesus, who saw his brother alive again, reported within months of the event, and Saul of Tarsus, renamed the Apostle Paul, on his way to persecute, imprison, and execute Christians by his own hand, acknowledged that he encountered Jesus after his public burial and death. This is a miracle, not just because it was predicted in the old, fulfilled in history, but falls in line with the purposes of God, which includes your salvation. God bless you. We'll see you all tomorrow.
You've been listening to A Reason for Hope. Thank you again for joining us as we continue our journey through God's Word, one question of the heart at a time. Until we meet again, we would love to connect with you. You can text or email your questions to questionsforhope@gmail.com. You can also find out more about our ministry at calvarychristianfellowship.com. And be sure to join us next time on A Reason for Hope. A Reason for Hope is an outreach ministry of Calvary Christian Fellowship in Tucson, Arizona.